Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's live streaming. I appreciate you all, whether you're watching this stream on YouTube or on Rumble. There is a lot of updates happening in Lebanon with the ceasefire talks. However, there are also lots of speculations, so I'm not really covering that particular case at the current moment for me to see exactly what's going on and what the ceasefire agreement is going to be about, and if there is going to be any ceasefire deal anyway between Israel and Hezbollah through the mediators. So we have to see first. I think this is going to be concrete and sealed or fail tomorrow. So if we know more about this case, especially about the nature of the agreement and the duration, because some say it's a ceasefire agreement, others says it's just a temporary ceasefire. So I want to first wait and see the result. And as we speak at the current moment, unfortunately, Israel is carpet bombing the southern suburbs of Beirut and leveling empty buildings. Some of them are empty and some of them are not. So this is the last moment desperation, in my opinion, bombing campaign against the Lebanese capital, forcing Hezbollah to either sabotage the ceasefire talks by serious escalation or probably trying to score points against Hezbollah at the last moment. We don't know yet the exact the goal and the nature of this type of attacks, or what's the purpose of them yet. But if I know more about it, and I think tomorrow will be detrimental and decisive, then we will speak about that tomorrow. But the neighboring country, Syria, is very important, and I've been trying to shed light on the situation in Syria for quite some time. This channel has been established in 2017, and since 2017, the main focus of this channel was Syria, and then we had other conflicts, unfortunately, that we had to also focus on them. And when I say unfortunately, that other conflicts started, and that's the unfortunate thing, right? We have nowadays Ukraine, we have the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Palestine, in Syria, in Lebanon, and probably in the future also in Taiwan. Now, my main argument for Syria was that the United States wanted to coup or remove Assad from power for the strategic benefit of the US in the region, for its absolute dominance on the region, and also for the safety and security of Israel. This has been a controversial thought for a long time. And many of the so-called, I wouldn't call them so-called because they are not left-wingers, but they call themselves left-wing, and they stood with the US secret war, dirty war against Syria, not knowing that this is another type of imperialistic war with non-conventional methods in order to remove a president who said no for the American project in the region and also for the Israeli hegemony in the region. Now, this is very difficult to explain to many people, despite the fact that the data, the information, the documents are all available nowadays for those who want to dig in and see. After the Gaza war, some of these people realized the importance of Syria and why Hezbollah basically went to Syria to fight against these terrorist groups, to protect its strategic depth and to protect its ally in Damascus, and also to protect the routes through which the technology and logistical support and military support comes to Hezbollah, which are later also given to the Palestinian factions. It took for some people, let's say 10 to 13 years, unfortunately, to notice that what has happened in Syria was not basically a popular uprising or a democratic revolution. It was a very it was a very highly sophisticated and costly covert operation by the CIA, by the Pentagon, by regional intelligence apparatuses, especially in Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Israel, and Jordan, to destabilize Syria, to power billions of dollars worth of weapons to these radical terrorists in the country. Those are the real terrorists, not the ones that the United States tells us to believe that they are terrorists, right? Those were the ones who were literally decapitating babies and raping women and ethnically cleansing minorities and committing genocide against the religious minorities in Syria. And those were the groups that were funded by the United States, by these regional countries, including a group which abducted my brother in 2012, which I was open about it and spoke about it. I don't want to repeat all the time. It's not a personal issue for me, but we were also victims of this conflict. My brother was abducted and kidnapped by a group that was directly supported by the CIA, funded by the CIA, trained by the CIA. And also our businesses are all gone in Syria with tens of thousands worth of products by the CIA-backed, Obama-backed, Clinton-backed, John Kerry-backed, the deep state-backed terrorist groups in Syria. So I know one thing or two about this conflict, and people come and call this, oh, this is an Assadist talking point. You're being an Assad apologist, this and that. And for me, I'm being very upfront with you. I'm being very honest with you. I don't support Assad as a person. I supported the president, whoever was the president, because for me, when I see that there is a foreign plot against the country and there are foreign intelligence apparatuses meddling in the country and trying to replace the government, then this is a foreign war against the country. And myself, if I stand with the foreign interventionists, then I'm being a collaborator with the foreign interventionists, including the United States. And do you really think that the United States wants the best interests of the Syrian people? It's funny that these people think this is an Assadist talking point. My point was very clear. Assad has a constitutional duty to protect Syria and to fight against this foreign meddling and foreign-backed insurgency. And if he leaves office and takes the offers that Qataris, Saudis, Americans have given to him, take the billions, go out, take refuge, live your life, etc. If he had done that, then I would have called him a traitor. So I have an expectation always from a leader of a country to protect his country from such foreign intervention. And I think this is something has become a little bit, it's not a controversial, but it is something that is missing in many other countries, because the politicians do not serve the interests of their own people. Rather, they are serving the interests of corporations, serving the private interests, serving the money, right? This is something that is missing in other places. Therefore, some so-called pundits, journalists, call them whatever you want, this intellectual class in the establishment approved intellectual class, they don't understand what's the meaning of patriotism. How can a leader be patriotic and defend his country and his people? So this is something that is very important for me. If I want to judge or evaluate a leader, I expect for a leader to be patriotic, to serve his people, and then to see how he can help outside or how to benefit from his power or might to project his power. I don't expect any leader to be clean or, let's say, 100% transparent. All politicians and all leaders throughout history, when they felt powerful, they tried to project their power. So I'm not being naive about these things. However, what I'm saying is, at least when people like Trump say America first, I also expect for my president to be Syria first, to take care of his people, to protect his people, and then to see if he wants to project his strength and might, if he has any, let's say, an extra power to project on the region. And Syria has done that in the past, in Lebanon, for example, when they intervened to stop the civil war and they installed their military, let's say, they established military presence there. So they projected their military power on Lebanon, and they had a bigger say over the Lebanese political discourse. And they have picked and chose MPs, ministers, even presidents in Lebanon, right? So I'm not naive about this. But when the war started against Syria, I had like around 3 months to realize what's happening and notice the patterns. Although I was very young, but I'm not fool enough to believe that the U.S., especially under Obama and Clinton, they wanted to bring democracy and human rights to Syria. I think this was clear from the example of Iraq. It was clear from the example of Libya. And also we have documented video for Wesley Clark saying that the US was plotting to overthrow 5 countries in 7 years, or 7 countries in 5 years. And this was in 2003 or so, or 2001, basically. I don't know, maybe 2001, 2002. And since then, they were trying to take over Syria, right? So we knew that they were coming, but we didn't know that they have chosen a non-conventional path to do that. However, today in 2024, this is no longer a controversial issue for many of the pundits and many of the journalists to speak about this case and say this was a regime change war, this was Obama's war, this was Clinton's war, and the CIA has spent $1 billion per year on these covert operations and secret CIA war and dirty war against Syria. And we're speaking of only the budget of the CIA, because in parallel we had also the Pentagon having its own program of training and arming these radical terrorists in Syria. And on the other side, we had also, or on the same side, we had also the Qataris who poured tens of billions of dollars. The Saudis poured tens of billions of dollars. The Erdogan's Turkey, Jordan, Israel. At least we're speaking about these countries who spend tens of billions of dollars. And then we had the European countries sending tens of millions of dollars again for non-lethal aid to these insurgent groups, including pickup trucks, laptops, communications, video cameras, photography cameras, establishing radio channels, TV channels, and all this stuff that are necessary to destabilize the country through psyops and through indoctrination, through propaganda, and also keeping the people who hate Assad continue this, let's say, hatred against Assad through many, many fake news that have been spreading or spread during the discourse of the Syrian war. I was watching the podcast of Tucker Carlson the other day with Greenwald, and this was an amazing chat actually between both sides, and I'm not here to promote any of them, but this was an amazing chat for me, especially the answers of Glenn Greenwald, and he's a very credible journalist on that matter. And he mentioned Syria at the beginning of the podcast because they were speaking about Tulsi Gabbard, and Tulsi Gabbard is going to be the director of the national security, I think, the director of the national security in the US, and Trump picked her. And because Tulsi Gabbard went to Syria in 2017 to see what's happening back then in Syria, and back then she was a congresswoman. I think she was from the Democratic Party still. Yes, she was still from the Democratic Party. And she went to Syria, and she allegedly met with President Bashar al-Assad and held talks with him and also with other Syrian officials. And she learned the reality on the ground also by talking to ordinary people, going to the hospitals and talking with the victims of the conflict and the war and the injured people, the civilians, from these mortars and hail cannons and the kidnappings of these CIA-backed terrorist groups in the country. So in this discourse, this is what they were talking about, because they were speaking of, like, if you want to escalate the conflict in Ukraine by giving Ukraine the right to fire American-made long-range missiles, the ATACMS, then of course you want to listen to Putin and know what he says about this case and what would be his reaction and type of retaliation, right? And then Glenn Greenwald says, yeah, this was the case with Tulsi Gabbard when she went to Syria in 2017, because she wanted to know, as a congresswoman, as a member of the military, what is the perspective in Syria, because at the end of the day, Congress can authorize or disauthorize war, right? And Obama was threatening for an intervention in Syria, and then Trump came and he said that he will end the regime change war against Syria. So what is going to be the position of Syria? This was important for an American official to come to Syria and listen to the Syrian perspective. This is what diplomacy is about. Diplomacy is not only talking to your friend, but also talking to your rivals, talking to your foes. And this is something has become very controversial nowadays, especially after the Ukraine war, that you cannot talk to Russia because then you're a treasonous collaborator with Russia. But you have to know what the Russians say. Like, if the Russians are telling you, if you fire ATACMS against us, we will do this and that. But if you don't know what the Russians are telling you, then you would not know what's going to be the next move of your enemy, right? So at least for the self-interest of your own country and your own political objectives, you have to listen what your enemy says it's going to do. If you do this, we will do that, right? So in this context, this is the context that I wanted to give you at the beginning. On this context, this is the conversation that Glenn Greenwald and Tucker Carlson have been talking about. I shared this on my X account. So on Tucker Carlson's show, Glenn Greenwald revealed the truth about U.S. involvement in Syria. The CIA poured $1 billion per year into a regime change war against President Bashar al-Assad. Let that sink in. $1 billion annually, your tax dollars fueling the conflict. Let's take a look first what he has to say in this case.
The thing that you said about encouraging Mike Johnson to speak to Putin, which of course, as the third in line to the presidency, as you said, when they're proposing to escalate a major war, of course you should want to understand the Russian perspective. This is what Tulsi Gabbard did in 2017 when she was a member of Congress and the Obama administration had unleashed this $1 billion a year CIA dirty war to change the government of Syria, to dislodge Bashar al-Assad from the government. And we fought along ISIS and Al-Qaeda, who also wanted Assad gone. We were told those were our existential enemies for 15 years. We fought alongside them to do it. And so many of the weapons we sent ended up in the hands of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other Islamic radical groups in Syria. And Tulsi Gabbard, as a member of the military, but also as a member of Congress with constitutional responsibility to authorize or disauthorize a war, wanted to go to Syria and see what was happening for herself. And then she spoke with Syrian officials and got an opportunity to speak with the Syrian president. And based solely on that, she's now accused of being a Russian agent, being some sort of, treasonous sympathizer of Bashar al-Assad. This is the jingoistic climate that has been created, way worse than what prevailed in the Cold War, when Nixon went to China, Reagan negotiated all kinds of arms deals with the Soviets. This is now totally prohibited. It's like we live in a Marvel cartoon for children where there's good guys and bad guys, where the good guys and you don't speak to the bad guys.
And the good guys
so
are
dangerous.
Al-Qaeda and ISIS. They're the good guys.
Yeah, we can fight with them because they're...
So her point, I don't want to speak for Tulsi Gabbard, our new Director of National Intelligence nominee, but my view was, I don't have any feelings about Assad or Syria, but it's a fact that that government protected religious minorities, including an ancient Christian community there, and the Alawites, of which he's one, in that country for a long time, he and his dad. So why are they my enemy exactly? I don't understand. Why should I be opposed to Assad in Syria? Why should I be opposed to Vladimir Putin?
That's a good question from Tucker. Why should any American oppose President Bashar or oppose Putin? I think that the enmity between Syria and the United States is not natural, because Syria is 10,000 kilometers away from the US. How could they be enemies? And how could Syria even pose any threat against the United States? And Syria is a small country with a small budget and relatively smaller army than other countries such as Iran, for example, right? And Syria never threatened the existence of the US in any way or shape, and not even their trade in the region, for example. But what the Syrians have done, basically, they didn't give the US a pass for its strategic aspirations in the region. But strategic aspirations of the US in the region are multiple folded. And one of which is, of course, militaristic dominance on the region, which Syria posed some threat against them, especially in Iraq and in Lebanon, and also the economic dominance on the region, the financial dominance on the region. And this is something that is important because Syria has given an access to the eastern shore to the eastern Mediterranean, for example, eastern shore of, or the western shore, no, eastern shore of the Mediterranean to the Russians, and has given an access to the Iranians in the country. So this was something that troubled the United States. At the same time, Syria posed a threat against Israel via supporting this armed struggle of the Palestinians and the Lebanese. And most importantly, when we speak about the financial and economic dominance in the region, there was the aspect of the energy dominance on the region, because the US had, for example, the Carter Doctrine in the 70s, which they said we have to guarantee the flow of the energy from the Gulf countries to the collective West. And it requires the US Army to intervene and use violent means in order to achieve that if the flow of the energy is disrupted. But now, because the US is already self-sufficient, they still want to have an energy dominance on the region because they don't want for their rivals and enemies to take advantage of the withdrawal of the US from these markets and buy cheap gas and cheap oil from the region, right? So this was the bigger picture. And through this discourse of this conflict, the Qataris wanted to extend their pipeline to Europe, and by doing so, they could kill the Nord Stream pipeline projects. I'm going to come to that later. But what is missing from this discussion between Tucker and Glenn Greenwald is these Americans basically, and just like many in the West, they have this Orientalistic lens, right? Like they put an Orientalist lens and they look into the region from this lens, and that is like religious minorities, Christians, Muslims, Alawites, Druze, etc., etc. Now, it is true. It is technically true that Assad protected the Christians in Syria and protected the other religious minorities, but that's not the purpose of that's not the reason why Assad fought against this regime change war. He fought for his country and for the sovereignty of this country and to keep the country united. And while he was fighting for this objective, of course, he protected the Christians because they're part of the Syrian society. And when the Christians and other minorities were targeted deliberately by these CIA-backed groups, then of course he protected them, but not because they were minorities. Like there were towns and cities, for example, like Aleppo. Aleppo is in northern Syria. It is one of the largest cities in Syria. It is overwhelmingly populated by Muslim Sunnis. And when the time came, the government, Assad, the army, Russians, Hezbollah, Iranians, they all fought in Aleppo to liberate the city from the terrorists, regardless of who is overwhelmingly in this city. But there were also other examples. For example, the battle for Ma'lula. Ma'lula is an ancient Christian city in Syria. You can Google it and you can see that people still speak Aramaic in this, the language of Jesus Christ. They speak and pray in Aramaic in this town, and it was attacked by CIA-backed, multiple CIA-backed groups. And they destroyed the monasteries, they looted the churches, and they killed the Christians there. So yes, of course, in this case, they protected the Christians, but not because they were Christians. But I'm saying that with extension of this strategy of defending the country, of course, they protected the Christians. But many American, especially on the right, or what they call the conservative Americans, this is something, it's important for them. Like, yeah, we have to protect the Christians, this and that. But for us in Syria, I'm myself Christian, I don't see this as a war against the Christians itself only. It's a war against Syria, but because the Christians are a minority and they were vulnerable, so they were probably disproportionately targeted by these terrorists. That's the case, right? Now, in this case, for example, Glenn Greenwald, he mentioned $1 billion, right, per year. And this is the big money, by the way. Some people say it's tens of billions of dollars per year. And I would say yes, because CIA only spent $1 billion on Syria. But the Qataris and the Saudis have poured tens of billions of dollars per year. And I'm going to prove to you that in this live streaming. But first, let's see what the CIA has done in Syria. This was an article published in the in the New York Times. The title says, "Behind the Sudden Death of a $1 billion Secret CIA War in Syria." Secret, see? And this was published in August 2017, just when Donald Trump ended the regime change war in Syria. So in 2017, this article is published by three authors. They say the end came quickly for one of the costliest covert action programs in the history of the CIA. The rebel army was by then a shell, hollowed out by more than a year of bombing by Russian planes and confined to ever-shrinking patches of Syria that government troops had not reconquered. Critics in Congress had complained for years about the costs. more than $1 billion over the life of the program, and reports that some of the CIA supplied weapons had ended up in the hands of a rebel group tied to Al-Qaeda, further sapped political support for the program. Now, this is something that I think it's a cover-up for the CIA, trying to portray it as if the CIA had no intention to deliver these arms to these more radical groups. No, the CIA collaborated with these more radical groups because they say this is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, and we in the CIA, with the good-hearted people, we don't want to collaborate with these Al-Qaeda groups, right? But unfortunately, one of the unfortunate consequences of this conflict was that some of our weapons ended up in the hands of these terrorists, so the support for them has shrinked in the Congress, and that's an utter lie, and I'm going to prove to you now. The CIA knowingly sent these weapons into the hands of these terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda offshoots, because they were the ones who were ready to carry out the fighting. They were the ones who were ready to die in this fight against the Syrian government or the Syrian army. The rest were not ready to put their lives in jeopardy for the sake of an alleged revolution. It was this ideological root or the ideological conviction of these Al-Qaeda types that kept them continue fighting for 10 to 13 years. Otherwise, in this hopelessness that they are living in now, like these rebels are now hopeless, like how can they now overcome the Syrian army? But it's the ideology that pushes them to continue fighting, right? But they don't say us these things of course, in American press. But I'm going to come back and tell you how false and how, I would say, distorted the reality that they're trying to present. So the shuttering of the CIA program, one of the most expensive efforts to arm and train rebels since the agency's program arming the Mujahideen in Afghanistan during the 80s, has forced a reckoning over its success and failures. Opponents say it was foolhardy, expensive, and ineffective. Now, if you remember, in the late 70s and early 80s, the Americans had this brilliant idea, right, to arm and train and encourage these Mujahideen, the radical fighters, to go to Pakistan. They established them training camps there with the support of the Saudi intelligence again, and encouraged all the brainless people around the world to go and fight against the Soviet Union because the Soviets are the infidels, right? This is how they encouraged them. And then it was Brzezinski in Afghanistan talking to the Mujahideen and telling them, you're going to liberate now your mosques and your Islamic land, etc., etc. This is a state-sponsored, CIA-sponsored, Pentagon-sponsored, deep state-sponsored terrorism, basically, that they created hubs in Pakistan, and then they sent all these herds to Afghanistan to fight against the Soviet Union, and it was successful for them. They basically forced the Soviet Union to withdraw from Afghanistan, and they pushed them into a huge and costly war against this Mujahideen. So they were successful in the 80s, but this time they were not successful. And the Russians came to support the Syrians, and they destroyed most of these terrorist groups, or the backbone of these terrorist groups, including Nusra, which is the offshoot of Al-Qaeda, and also ISIS. Something that I'm just trying to give you what is missing in this article, right? That they won't tell you. So now the program did have periods of success, they say, including in 2015, when rebels using tank-destroying missiles supplied by the CIA and also Saudi Arabia routed government forces in northern Syria. But by late 2015, the Russian military offensive in Syria was focusing squarely on the CIA-backed fighters battling Syrian government troops. Many of the fighters were killed, and the fortunes of the rebel army reversed. So what do they don't tell us here? Who was carrying out these anti-tank attacks against the Syrian government forces? Who acquired and who took over these tank-destroying missiles, all these American-made anti-tank missiles? They were Al-Nusra Front. They were the ones who attacked on Idlib. They were the ones who attacked on Aleppo. Those are the northern fronts, right? So this is something also they don't mention. Now, finally, Mr. Trump has twice publicly criticized the effort since he ended it. After the Washington Post first reported on his decision, Mr. Trump tweeted that he was ending massive, dangerous, and wasteful payment to Syrian rebels fighting Assad. During an interview with the Wall Street Journal last month, the president said many of the CIA-supplied weapons ended up in the hands of Al-Qaeda, presumably a reference to Al-Qaeda-affiliated Nusra Front, which often fought alongside the CIA-backed rebels. So still, the narrative is that it is an unintended consequence that these American weapons ended up in the hands of Al-Qaeda-affiliated groups, which is not the case. It was deliberate because they were the strongest force fighting against the Syrian government forces. We have an astonishing interview for the former foreign minister of Qatar. So the former foreign minister of Qatar is Hamad bin Jassim, and for those who don't know or didn't follow up the Syrian war, in 2012, 2012, he was the foreign minister of Qatar, and Qatar played the most instrumental and most important role during this discourse of this conflict. The United States came, the CIA, Pentagon, they came to Qatar and they tasked Qatar to lead the Syrian war, just like they led the Libyan war. In Libya, it was Qatar which funded most of these terrorist groups to oust Gaddafi and kill him. So the Qataris played again a very dirty role in Syria. And so the foreign minister back then, who was Hamad bin Jassim, he had an instrumental role in orchestrating this regime change war against Syria. Now, Hamad bin Jassim, when he left his position, I think in 2017, after the failure of the regime change war in Syria, he gave an interview to national Qatari TV, during which he dropped a bombshell revelation that the Americans came and they tasked the Qataris to lead this file, the Syrian file or the Syrian war. And then the Saudis intervened and they wanted to lead this war. And I want you also to focus on the terminologies he uses during this interview, which is subtitled now to English. So you have to read the captions if you want to understand what he says. And basically he's saying, like, he talks in a very bizarre way, and he says, like, while we were fighting over the prey, and the prey is Assad, basically. So he says, like, we and the Saudis and the Turks, we were fighting over the prey escaped, and we're still fighting. He also mentions the military operation room, which I spoke about it in length. So for those who don't know, there were two joint military operation room, one in Jordan and one in Turkey. In Jordan, it was called MOK, and in Turkey, it was called MOM. So these were joint military operations room headed by the US, headed by the CIA and Pentagon. And also they were members of the Saudi, Qatari, Turkish, Jordanian, and also probably Israeli intelligence officers and military personnel leading these operations inside Syria. So they're the ones choosing the battles, the timing, the geography, and what type of weapons they have to deliver to this group and that group. So he's also speaking about this. So take a look what he has to say about this. This is subtitled by Walid, who unfortunately passed away. He was a friend of Syriana Analysis as well. Now his son is he's in charge of his let's say site. I will just do this so that you can see the subtitles well. Let's go.
أول ما بدأ الموضوع سوريا توجهت للمملكة العربية السعودية وقابلت الملك عبد الله بناء الله يرحمه بناء على تعليمات من سمو الأمير الوالد. قلت له هذه الحالة، قال لي احنا معاكم، انتم امشوا في هذا الموضوع واحنا بننسق، ولكنكم انتم خلكم مستلمين الموضوع. واستلمناه، ما اريد ادخل في تفاصيل، عندنا ادله كامله على الاستلام في هذا الموضوع، وكان اي شيء يروح لتركيا، وكان ينسق مع القوات الامريكيه. وكان توزيع كل شيء كان يتم عن طريق القوات الامريكيه والاتراك واحنا والاخوان السعوديين، وكان كل حد موجود العسكريين.
See, so what he basically says that all this military support that they sent to Syria through Turkey, it all were given an approval of the US. So they send all these weapons and money and training and ammunition and this and that to Turkey. And in this joint operation room where the Americans have a presence there, the Americans give an approval, and then these Arabic countries, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, used to send this type of weapons to Syria. Now, notice what he has to say here. He is trying to say, like, maybe there were some mistakes. Maybe some of our weapons ended up in the hands of Al-Nusra Front. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not sure about it. But when they told us to stop supporting Al-Nusra, we stopped supporting Al-Nusra. But we didn't support ISIS. ISIS is too much for us, right? But that's another blatant lie. The Qataris supported ISIS. Saudi Arabia also supported ISIS back then. And also they all supported Al-Nusra. It's not maybe. It's not like something like, oh my God, I don't know, maybe it happened. No, they supported Al-Nusra Front as well. Now see what he has to say.
يمكن حصل خطأ انه في فصيل دعم في فترة بس مش داعش، هذا موضوع يعني زودوها. يمكن النصرة كان في علاقة، يمكن كان في، انا والله ما اعرف.
Maybe, I don't know.
اقول حتى لو كان هذا الموضوع عندما جاء ان النصرة غير مقبولة توقف هذا الدعم من النصرة وكان التركيز على تحرير سوريا. احنا تهاوشنا على الصيدة.
So he says we were fighting over the lady. This is prey. So we were fighting over the prey. This translation is not correct. We were fighting over the prey, and now the prey is gone, and we are still fighting.
وفلتت الصيدة واحنا قاعدين نتهاوش عليها. الآن انقتل في سوريا بشار موجود. طيب انتم الآن تقولون بشار اوكي خلي يبقى. ما عندنا مانع، ما عندنا ثأر مع بشار ولا عندنا، كان صديق لنا. لكن انتم كنتوا معنا في خندق واحد، غيرتوا تقولوا لنا احنا بنغير. القضية في يعني في عدم استمرارية، وانا ما عندي مانع ان الواحد يغير اذا لما يلقى نفسه غلطان.
So basically, he's just now criticizing Saudi Arabia because in 2017 there was this rift between the Saudis and the Qataris, and he went in public and exposing these revelations because he doesn't want for the Saudis to blame them alone, that they were the ones supporting these terrorist groups in Syria. And he said, look, we have all the evidence. We took over this file because you, Saudi Arabia, said, okay, you take the lead, and we lead it from behind. And there were some mistakes maybe happened. I don't know. Maybe we supported Al-Nusra Front, maybe not. Nobody knows. But ISIS, we didn't support. If the Qataris didn't support ISIS, if the Turks didn't support ISIS, if the Saudis didn't support ISIS, if the Israelis didn't support ISIS, if the Americans didn't support it, who supported ISIS? How did ISIS became? How has ISIS occupied largest swaths of the Syrian territory, almost like half the country? If it wasn't ISIS, then who gave them all these Toyota trucks? Then who gave them all these American weapons? And who allowed them to occupy oil fields? And who bought the oil from ISIS? Right? If it's not them, then who? If there is a joint operation room in Turkey just for the purpose of it, and then you see that ISIS is the most efficient group against the Syrian government or against Assad, of course you will support them, or at least you will turn a blind eye to their expansion. Now, there is another conversation with Hamad Ben Jassim in an interview. This is a part of a larger documentary. I'm just going to show you a part of it. In this, again, because there was this rift between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, so he started going to public to speak about these cases, right? And in this particular interview, he mentions that in 2013, so the Qataris took charge of the Syrian war between 2011 and 2013. And in 2013, just for you to know, the Saudis changed the head of their national intelligence, and they appointed Bandar bin Sultan. For those who don't know, Bandar bin Sultan was the Saudi ambassador in Washington, D.C. for around 20 years. And he was the guy who was the ambassador of Saudi Arabia during 9/11. And he had very close ties to the Bush family. He was even called Bandar Bush during that time. So he has strong ties to the US deep state, to the US intelligence, to the CIA, and he took charge of the Saudi intelligence in 2013. And see what happened in 2013. In 2013, ISIS has been formed. And the false flag chemical attacks started to happen in Syria. Only when Bandar bin Sultan took over the intelligence in Saudi Arabia, we saw the establishment of ISIS, because Nusra was in 2012. because the Qataris established al-Nusra, and in 2013, when Bandar came to power, he most likely established ISIS in Syria, and then they started these false flag chemical attacks. But Bandar bin Sultan, when he came, like, it was already 2 years to the war, and he was very upset because it took so long. For them, they thought this is going to last like few months. If you were in Syria in 2011, the Americans, the Saudis, the Qataris, they were talking to their people, to their collaborators, people who call themselves opposition, or even just neutral people, and telling them, don't defend Assad because in 3 months he will be gone. Because the Americans decided to get rid of him, and the Saudis and the Qataris and the rest are like in the same camp, so he doesn't have any chance to survive. So when Bandar came as the head of the intelligence in 2013, he was very upset because it took 2 years. They thought it's going to be like 3-4 months, but it's now 2 years already. So he called all the foreign ministers of the allied countries of Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, Qatar, Turkey, USA. We don't know if the Israelis were present, but there were many rich countries in this meeting. And he told them, we need to allocate $2 trillion to oust Assad. $2 trillion. It's not a billion. It's not 20 billion. It's not 200. We're talking about $2 trillion. According to the foreign minister of Qatar, Hamad bin Jassim, who says he was present in this meeting. So take a look what this this revelation is about. I also have the video for you, and I subtitled it for you.
ولذلك جاء في مرحلة بندر استلم الاستخبارات السعودية وسلم هذا الملف.
الأمير بندر بن سلطان.
بندر بن سلطان سلم هذا الملف، بدأ يعني يخطط لكيفية إنهاء الموضوع.
إنهاء أي موضوع؟
موضوع بشار، إنه بيخلص الموضوع في سوريا في خلال أشهر، إنه على أساس إنه تغيير السلطة في سوريا.
فهي كانت رغبة من الأمير بندر؟
لا، مش من بندر، هاي رغبتنا كلنا، مش رغبة السعودية بس هاي كان الهدف، لأنه في ثورة، والثورة تطالب بإزالة بشار الآن. ما عادت هي موضوع لأنه عندك غرفتين عمليات، ليش موجودة لهذا الهدف. طلب ميزانية ضخمة مالية في حدود 2000 مليار دولار بندر.
بس انت ذكرت انت اللي متصدين الملف؟
لا احنا متصدرين الملف، بيجيك احنا تصدرنا الملف اول كم شهر بعد ما جاء بندر، هو اراد انه، فصار خلاف بيننا وبين بندر على كيفية إدارة الموضوع، وجات ميزانية ضخمة البندر وطالبوا الدول تساهم، ما ساهمت قطر في ذاك الوقت.
So, Bandar asked $2 trillion to oust Assad. We don't know how much they gathered in this meeting, but I think in my estimates, this amount was over $200 billion. And this is a huge amount of money. If you want to compare it to Ukraine, the size of Ukraine with the size of Syria, and you see that what the Americans have spent basically around 160 billion or 180 billion now in Ukraine, and compare it to Syria with $200 billion and the size of the two countries, it's a lot of money, and it's a lot of weapons. So it's a really miracle that Syria foiled this regime change war in its military aspect. They couldn't yet finish all the insurgent groups, basically, and the terrorist groups in Idlib yet. I'm hopeful that they would. I believe that Syria will liberate every inch of the territory. I believe when Bashar al-Assad says that every inch of Syria will be liberated, I believe that he will do it. He's the man of his word, whether we like him or not. And I also believe that the Americans will withdraw from Syria sooner or later. Those are there are a set of beliefs that I have. It's just it's in my gut feeling. Sometimes it's not based on academic or political understanding. In 2011, 2012, when everybody told me that Assad is leaving and the country will witness a regime change and this and that, and don't defend him, don't speak positively about him, because then you will lose your job opportunities, you will lose your credibility, basically, right? Because you have all the time ahead, you're only 21 years old, don't waste your all your future for someone who is going to leave in a matter of 3 months. But something deep inside me, like here, was telling me there's something wrong. How can it be possible? How can he leave in 3 months? It's impossible. There is a huge military strength in Syria, and it revolves around loyalty to the president. And there are all these intelligence apparatuses. How is it possible that everyone turns against him? Anyways, I don't want to say I was proven correct, but at least they were proven to be wrong. These people were proven to be wrong. And now there is something deep inside me that tells me that Syria will emerge complete victorious from this, and they will kick out the American occupation forces from Syria, and they will liberate Idlib as well. Now, why Qatar was so enthusiastic about this? This is not a mystery. I think this is something that is very clear for everyone, because Qatar was, anyways, it was an ally of Syria, right? Or a friend of Syria, just like the foreign minister of Qatar said. But this was mostly about a fight over the pipeline project. So this is not the best quality of map, but you see the purpose, right? So the gas is coming from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, and to Turkey. And Turkey would have been the hub to receive the Qatari gas and then distribute it to Greece, and from Greece to the rest of Europe. So Turkey was promised a huge role in this, and also the Qataris. And that also explains why the Russians also intervened at a later stage to protect their pipeline projects in Europe, because if this project comes to realization and then the Qataris are sending the gas to Europe, then the Europeans will not need the Russian Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 any longer, right? So this is one of the reasons why the Russians intervene, and this is also one of the reasons why Qatar was so enthusiastic to remove Assad from power, and also why Turkey was so enthusiastic to remove Assad from power, because Assad said no to this project, and he preferred gas pipeline project between Iran, Baghdad, or Iraq, Syria, and from Syria goes to Turkey. But because Turkey is a close ally to Qatar and they're ideologically very close to each other, Turkey preferred the Qatari gas pipeline over the Iranian, because then Iran will become a stronger regional power compared to Turkey, and Turkey doesn't want for Iran to be a stronger regional power, because it has its own aspirations. But Qatar, because of its relatively small size, they cannot really match the Turkish regional aspirations anyway, even if they send all this gas to Europe, right? So these were the calculations from both sides, and why they were so enthusiastic to remove Assad from power. Now, when we were reading this article in the New York Times, and they were mentioning this, like the officials were so upset that some of these weapons were ending up in the hands of the Al-Qaeda types, right? And this was an unintended consequence of this war. And that's a utter lie, because we have the emails of Hillary Clinton, basically. This is a document published by WikiLeaks, of course. This is the Hillary Clinton email archive. And if we see this email from Jake Sullivan, who is the national security advisor to Biden now, and he was working for Hillary Clinton in 2012. So as you can see, in February 12, 2012 at 4 p.m. In Washington, D.C., he sends an email to Hillary Clinton, something like spot report, something, SBU. And he says, see last item, he sent something to Hillary Clinton, and he says, Al-Qaeda, AQ is Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. So as you can see, they knew beforehand that they were supporting Al-Qaeda types in Syria. This was not something like unintended, right? And I asked, so I told you in a previous live streaming, I'm using this Brave browser, and it has a brilliant AI search engine in it. And I asked this AI search engine what's its take on Jake Sullivan's Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria email. And the AI says, according to released emails from Hillary Clinton's tenure as Secretary of State, Jake Sullivan, then a policy planner at the State Department, he wrote to Clinton on February 12, 2012, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. This statement suggests that the US government at that time perceived Al-Qaeda as being aligned with the opposition forces in Syria rather than as a terrorist organization seeking to overthrow the Syrian government. Then he says, this email was part of a larger discussion about US policy in Syria, which was marked by a lack of clarity and consistency. The Obama administration's approach to the Syrian conflict was characterized by a failure to establish a clear strategy leading to a de facto support for various rebel groups, including those with extremist ideologies. The statement by Jake Sullivan, now the National Security Advisor to President Biden, highlights the complexity of the US role in Syria during that period. It also underscores the potential consequences of empowering extremist groups, as Al-Qaeda would later evolve into an Islamic State, ISIS, and become a major threat to regional and global security. So, if there is anyone comes and tells you this is an unintended consequence and they didn't want to support the Al-Qaeda types, please show him this video. Just send him the link of this video and let him watch. Another evidence that we have in our hands that basically the United States saw Al-Qaeda as an ally in Syria is this interview with the leader of Al-Qaeda, basically, and on PBS. So they're trying to whitewash him here. And they called him Syrian militant and former Al-Qaeda leader. So he's now former because he suddenly decided to, look a little bit clean, shave more, and dress like a Westerner, basically suit. So he's no longer Al-Qaeda in their eyes. They're trying to whitewash him here. And this was an article or an interview published in 2021. They wanted to convert this Al-Qaeda group into some moderate rebel type of insurgent group. But we have James Jeffrey, who was the U.S. ambassador under both Republican and Democratic administration, and most recently he was the special representative for Syria. So they under Trump and under Obama, he was a special envoy to Syria. He told Smith is the guy who conducted this interview with Jolani, that Jolani's organization, which is Al-Nusra Front, the offshoot of Al-Qaeda, was, quote, an asset to America's strategy in Idlib. So Al-Qaeda has been an asset to America's strategy in Idlib. It's not only something unintended, it was deliberate. And he says they are the least bad option of the various options on Idlib. And Idlib is one of the most important places in Syria, which is one of the most important places right now in the Middle East, Jeffrey said in an interview on March 8. So the ambassador of the US, basically, or the special envoy of the US to Syria, which he resides probably in Turkey somewhere, and he says that Al-Qaeda was basically an asset. So it's an ally, basically, of the US in Syria, right? Finally, if you think this is only if this was only about Al-Qaeda, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but this was not only about Al-Qaeda, but also ISIS, the more radical and extremist than Al-Qaeda, right? So I think this was in 2016, John Kerry, when he was the Secretary of State of the US, he met with some Syrian opposition activists in Washington, D.C. in a private meeting, and they were speaking about Syria. And they were all talking about how the Russians basically came in 2015, late 2015, and destroyed the regime change war. And all these so-called opposition activists who had high hopes that Assad is going to leave. And now, thankfully, finally, some terrorist group, ISIS or Nusra, are going to take over the country. And they had some wet dreams, let's say. And now they're having this discussion among themselves and debate between John Kerry and this group of opposition figures. And it seems either somebody wired and bugged the room, had a recorder in that room, or one of these opposition activists, he was probably an intelligence asset for the Syrian government or something, I don't know. And he was recording the conversation, and they had this he leaked basically this recording to the public later. I'm going to show you what John Kerry had to say about ISIS, because just for you to give you context, when he was speaking about this, he's basically telling the opposition figures or the opposition activists that we were watching the expansion of ISIS in Syria, and they were basically not doing anything against ISIS because they thought that if ISIS expands and reaches to Damascus, then Assad will be under huge pressure and he will come and compromise and give what the Americans want. This is what John Kerry said. Take a look.
By the legitimate regime, they were invited in and we're not invited in. We're flying in airspace there where they can turn on the air defense and we have a very different scene. They are targeted by the opposition and we are arming. So, and training. The reason Russia came in is because ISIL was getting stronger. Daesh was threatening the possibility of going to Damascus and so forth. And that's why Russia came in, because they didn't want a Daesh government. And they supported Assad. And we know that this was growing. We were watching. We saw that Daesh was growing in strength. And we thought Assad was threatened. We thought, however, we could probably manage, that Assad might then negotiate. Instead of negotiating, you got Assad. Now you got Putin to support him.
So, according to the former Secretary of State of the US, who was back then the Secretary of State in 2016, he told Syrian opposition activists that the reason Russia came to Syria is because they didn't want an ISIS government and they supported Assad. And we know that this was wrong. We were watching, we saw that ISIS was growing in strength, and we thought Assad might then negotiate. Instead, he got Putin to support him. This is, I'm just presenting to you all these facts and all these leaked documents and audio revelations. And if you think this is an Assadist talking point, it's up to you. But I think the facts are on my side. This is what I believe and firmly believe. And one of our friends says, thanks for this. I always wanted to know what really happened in Syria. When I think back, I get mad at myself because I believed the media back then. It's totally fine, my friend. Many, many people were fooled, including myself at the first 3 months. But I did consistent work and research about this and to learn about these facts and realities on the ground in order to debunk basically these lies, and secondly, in order to prevent similar attempts by the US deep state and the CIA in other countries, because when I expose such lies to the people, I hope that there would be people from Latin America, from African countries, from Asian countries, from other countries that the US consistently and continuously targets, right? So that they learn from these mistakes. And that's also why I speak about Ukraine, because I don't want for the Ukrainian example to be copied in Armenia or Georgia or in any other country. We have to speak about these facts openly and document them and basically try to educate the people, right? It's not like I'm a teacher here, but I know one thing or two about what happened in my country, and I can assure you, vast majority of the people who spoke about Syria, analyzed about Syria, and they wrote books about Syria, and they, all these speculations and wishful thinkings, they don't know anything about Syria. Very, very few people know Syria, its social structure, its political system, its military capabilities. They haven't lived in Syria, right? It's very few people who really, really understand Syria, and they were able to foresee what could happen next and what Syria is facing, basically, what type of covert operation, what type of regime change war it is facing. So I feel like it's my duty to make such videos and try to shed light on these realities so that for the sake of my country, for historical purposes, so that people can use these materials later for educational purposes and tell the people what really happened and not what the mainstream media has told them. I don't know. I just feel it's a duty of mine to do these type of streams. And I really, really appreciate all of you guys. Hundreds of you are watching this live streaming. I'm very happy to see you also interacting in the live chat. If you like this content, if you like the work I'm doing, simple thing is just like the video, hit the like button, and also subscribe to my YouTube channel. And if you like to support my work financially, you can become a patron. The link is scrolling on the screen, patreon.com/Syriana Analysis. This channel is independent. It's 100% funded and financed by the AdSense and the patrons of Syriana Analysis. No other funding sources. I reject to receive any funding sources, etc., etc. Now, I wanted to show you only one thing at the end, but I think I lost the page. And this was like something like Zaatar. Anyways, it seems that the Israelis are trying to claim that Zaatar, or the Stimian, is basically an Israeli dish or Israeli spices. So I was going to make a joke about it and mock it, but I lost the page. But if you want to taste what we call in Aleppo Zaatar, it's a timian, but we eat it. It's not like only seasoning. You can basically put it in an olive oil, add some olive oil on it, and eat it with the bread. It's really delicious. Or you can also, make the bread crunchy, for example, and add some olive oil on the timian, and you can eat it. It's very delicious. We eat it in Aleppo, in Jordan, in elsewhere. If you want to purchase it, I put the link in from Amazon in the description below. Those are affiliate links, but you're not going to pay anything extra. But if you're in Europe, it's written in Europe. You can buy it from Europe or from the United States. Taste it and let me know if you like it. Myself, I really like it, but I prefer the Aleppo one. Unfortunately, I can't find the Aleppo one here now. But anyways, maybe somebody, if somebody is from Aleppo and coming to Berlin, hit me up. Bring me some Zaatar and timian with you. Okay, guys. I was very happy to see all your comments and interactions today in the live chat. We will definitely see each other tomorrow. It's going to be Wednesday, 5 p.m. Central European Time, 11 a.m. Eastern American Time. Stay tuned for that. Peace be upon you, upon your families. Salam.